The last honest thing the forest did that night was burn. Firebase Kestrel, December 14th, 11:47 in the evening. The radio had been silent for 6 hours. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet night, not the silence of men sleeping in rotation and equipment running on low power. This was the silence of a place that had stopped answering, a place that had been asked a question and decided not to respond. Sergeant First Class Kate Mercer had been standing watch for 11 minutes when she first smelled it. She had been in the field long enough to know the catalog of smells that a military outpost produced at night, the particular density of wood smoke from a fire that had been burning since Tuesday, the diesel exhaust from the generator running at the eastern edge of the compound, the cold mineral smell of the Bitterroot Range in December, which was unlike any other cold she had ever known, cleaner and older, and entirely indifferent to the people moving through it. This was different. This was the smell of something that was not supposed to burn. Resin and wall insulation, treated pine soaking in heat it was never designed to hold. The sharp, irreversible smell of a structure becoming something other than what it was built to be. She was already on her feet when the sound of breaking glass reached her from the direction of the bunkhouse. She moved. The outpost had no official name on any document she had seen before arriving. On the command maps it appeared as Firebase Kestrel, a cluster of structures carved into a shallow depression between two ridgelines in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana, accessible by a single logging road that became impassable after the first hard freeze of November. It was now December 14th. The road had been impassable for 3 weeks. Whoever came in by helicopter. Whoever went out the same way, or didn't go out at all. There were 7 of them. Kate had been here 12 days, long enough to learn every face by its shadows, long enough to know every set of footsteps by the sound it made on frozen ground at 2 in the morning, long enough to understand the geography of trust and suspicion that developed in any small group isolated long enough from everything else. She had not known until tonight how wrong that geography was. The bunkhouse was a rectangular structure of dark-stained pine logs 16 feet wide and 30 feet long, 2 windows on each long wall, and a single door at the southern end. Kate had been quartered there since arriving. She had noted without particular concern at the time that the door swung inward and could be barred fast from inside with a drop bar. But it could also be secured from outside with a padlock threaded through a heavy hasp. She was 30 feet away when she saw the padlock. It was in place. She stopped, put her hand flat on the pine surface of the door, and felt the heat already radiating through the wood like a slow pulse. Tested the drop bar from outside. It gave nothing. She stepped back and looked at the windows. Firelight was moving behind the glass of the nearest one, and the lower corners were beginning to bubble from the heat building beneath them. The facts of the situation arranged themselves in her mind with the cold clarity she brought to long-range ballistics. Someone had started the fire while she was on watch. The padlock had been secured from outside. She had been the only person in the bunkhouse. She looked toward the tree line. 2 figures stood at the edge of the pines, 60 meters distant, watching. Even at that distance, in the unsteady orange light of the burning structure, she recognized the taller one by the set of his shoulders. The slight forward lean that was almost a permanent feature of his posture after 25 years of carrying weight in places that didn't forgive poor form. Master Sergeant Daniel Cross, her team lead for 3 years. The man who had recommended her for this assignment. The man who had stood in a doorway in Idaho 4 years ago and walked into a firefight to pull her out of it without being asked, without hesitation, without making it into something that needed to be explained afterward. The shorter figure she recognized by the shape of the rifle slung at his side. Specialist Trent Holloway, the team's communications specialist, 26 years old, a young man who told bad jokes about the weather and had once held her hand without being asked when she received difficult news about someone she had lost. They were watching the fire. They were not moving. Kate stood between the burning bunkhouse and the 2 men she had trusted. She felt something in the architecture of her understanding shift and settle into a new configuration that was uglier and more permanent than anything she had believed before coming to this mountain. She had perhaps 4 seconds before one of them looked away from the fire and toward where she was standing. She moved, not toward the road, not toward the communications building or the equipment shed or any structure that would funnel her into predictable space. She went north along the back wall of the bunkhouse, where the shadow was deepest, angling toward the drainage channel that ran along the base of the western ridgeline. The channel was 3 feet deep and choked with frozen brush, invisible from 30 meters in daylight and invisible from 3 meters in this darkness. She dropped into it without slowing. Behind her, the bunkhouse roof began to go. 200 meters up the western slope. Moving through snow-loaded spruce boughs that bent and released their weight in soft, muffled collapses around her. She had her rifle. She had the sidearm and the drop holster on her right thigh. She had the knife at her left hip. She had the survival kit she kept strapped to her body during every watch rotation, a habit developed after a forward operating base in Idaho had been overrun without warning, leaving her with nothing but what she carried. Her left shoulder had struck the frozen ground hard when she tumbled out of the drainage channel onto the slope beyond. She could feel the joint working poorly, not dislocated, strained in a way that would stiffen badly within the hour. Her right forearm had taken a burn across it during those seconds when she had braced against the wall of the bunkhouse, searching for angles. 6 inches long, already past the stage of acute pain and settling into a deep continuous presence she could either attend to or set aside. She set it aside. At 240 meters of elevation, she found a natural shelf of granite that overhung enough to provide cover from above. She stopped, controlled her breathing, and listened. The wind moved through the canopy with a sound like distant water. Something moved through the brush 40 meters to her right. From below came the muted sound of voices, too distorted by distance to parse into words. She pressed herself against the granite and waited for full dark to return to the forest now that the fire was dying. She pressed cold snow against the burn on her forearm. She breathed slowly and with discipline. And she thought about Idaho, 4 years earlier, a forward operating base in the mountains outside of Chalice. The attack had come at 0340 on a Tuesday in March, which was the kind of detail that stayed with a person not because of the numbers, but because of the way the mind locked on to ordinary information when everything else was chaos. Kate had been in the secondary communications room when the perimeter went. She had her rifle and she had a vest, and she had approximately 11 seconds between the sound of the first breach and the moment the door to her room opened from outside. It was Cross who opened it. Not because he had been assigned to her location. Not because anyone had told him to. He had simply looked at the layout of the base, looked at the direction of the breach, and calculated where the people he was responsible for would be most exposed. He came through the door moving low and fast, and he said exactly 2 words. With me. They had moved through 3 corridors and 1 open courtyard under fire. Cross had positioned himself between Kate and the direction most likely to produce incoming rounds each time. Not performing it, not making it a gesture, simply doing the math of the situation and placing his body accordingly, the way a man did something when it had become reflex rather than decision. Afterward, when the count had been taken and the reports were being written, someone had asked Cross why he had gone to the secondary communications room first instead of the armory. He had looked at the person asking as though the question were genuinely puzzling. Because that's where Mercer was, he said. Kate had been standing close enough to hear. She had carried it for 4 years as the clearest definition she knew of what the word trustworthy actually meant when you stripped away everything it was used to mean in context that cost nothing. On the granite shelf with the smell of burning pine still in her jacket and the temperature dropping toward 15 below, she thought about Daniel Cross walking into a firefight without being asked. And she thought about Daniel Cross standing 60 meters from a burning building with a padlock on the door watching, not moving. The 2 images would not resolve. They sat beside each other in her mind like objects that did not belong in the same room. And she understood, in the way the mind accepted information it had been resisting, that the version of Cross who had walked into a firefight for her had not disappeared. It had simply been insufficient to prevent the version standing at the tree line from existing alongside it. People were not one thing. She had known this her entire life. She had simply not applied it here to this man in this configuration. The fire below peaked and began to diminish. The bunkhouse burned for approximately 90 minutes. She knew this because she tracked the orange glow fading from the underside of the cloud cover above the ridgeline. A slow extinction sector by sector as the structure collapsed into its own footprint and the fuel load diminished. She did not sleep. She moved twice during the night, following the granite shelf northward for roughly 200 meters, then cutting east along a secondary drainage until she found a position that gave her a clear sight line to both the access road and the area around the communications building. She settled in, pulled the thermal blanket from her survival kit, and wrapped herself with the reflective side inward to minimize her infrared signature. Packed snow around the outer edges of her position until it looked from any angle beyond 60 meters like an undifferentiated feature of the slope. Through the scope, she could observe the burned footprint of the bunkhouse still faintly smoking in the cold air. The communications building, the equipment shed, the north face of the prefabricated structure the team called the ops room, which held the mission planning materials and the satellite uplink. She watched and waited and thought about what she actually knew. 12 days ago, Kate had been briefed on a private military contractor called Apex Resource Group. Apex held a federal extraction license for the Bitterroot region. The license covered a preliminary survey for rare earth mineral deposits. The team's mission was straightforward: observe and catalog. Personnel vehicles, communication patterns. No engagement, strictly eyes. She had been recruited for this assignment by Cross himself. She had felt the satisfaction of being chosen by someone she respected for something that would be difficult. 8 days into the observation cycle, Corporal Leland Webb had found her during a watch change and stood close enough to speak below the wind. Someone is selling our position logs. 3 repositions. Every time we moved, they moved first. It's not coincidence. She had looked at him for a moment. You sure he had given her the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion that frightened him and was waiting to see if she had arrived there too? She had not. Not then. On the granite shelf, with the wind cutting through her jacket and the burn on her forearm throbbing in slow pulses, she arrived there now. Cross had recruited her. Cross had briefed her. Cross had designed the observation rotation that put her in the bunkhouse alone during the late watch. Cross had known she would be alone, and Cross had understood that Kate Mercer could not simply be reassigned or neutralized through any means that left a clean record. She was too documented, too decorated. Her disappearance, if it looked like operational loss in a remote location, would close faster and cleaner than her disappearance, if it looked like something deliberate. Fire in a remote outpost. Everyone assumed dead, no body to recover because the fire had destroyed the evidence. Except she was not dead. She pulled the survival radio from her kit and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it back. Any transmission she sent would be monitored by Holloway, whose entire function was communications. And if Cross had the resources to burn a firebase and stand at the tree line watching it, he had the resources to intercept a distress call and neutralize the response before it reached anyone she could trust. She needed to think about this differently. She was not waiting for rescue. She was conducting an operation. The parameters were simple in the way that very few things were simple. Not easy, but clean and free of ambiguity. Cross had decided she was a liability and moved to eliminate her. He had been wrong about one thing, and that one thing changed every calculation that followed. She was alive. She was armed. She knew this ridgeline better than anyone in the outpost below because she had spent 11 of her 12 days here studying it from the ground up. Every drainage channel and rock formation and sightline. Not because she had been told to, because she was the kind of person who studied terrain the way other people read weather as a matter of survival arithmetic, so deeply ingrained it had stopped feeling like a choice. Cross was down there with remaining personnel. Holloway and whoever else among the 7 was complicit, and whoever was not. She did not yet know which of the 5 were which. She would find out. Dawn came with the reluctance of a December morning at elevation. Not a brightening so much as a slow transition from one kind of darkness to another. The deep black of night giving way to a pewter gray that offered no warmth and promised nothing. At 6:13 in the morning, she observed her first movement through the scope. A figure emerged from the ops room, moving toward the burned footprint of the bunkhouse. Medium height, heavy jacket. He stopped at the edge of the burned area and stood there. When he turned slightly, she identified him by the angle of his jaw and the way he held his weight. Trent Holloway. He was carrying a tablet, making notes. He made a slow circuit of the burn site, stopped once to photograph something on the ground, then returned to the ops room. The door closed. Kate lay still and considered what she had seen. He was documenting the burn. Not with the body language of someone cataloging a tragedy, with the body language of someone completing a task. She had spent enough years watching people through scopes to know the difference between grief and administration. Holloway was doing administration. At 6:41, Cross appeared, moving from the ops room toward the equipment shed with the unhurried authority of a man who did not believe himself to be in danger. He was wrong about that. She settled the crosshairs on the space between his shoulders and breathed. One full inhalation, the pause at the top, the slow, controlled release. She did not fire. A dead Cross now would tell her nothing about who else was complicit, nothing about the scope of what Apex Resource Group was actually doing in this valley, nothing about the authorization chain connecting this outpost to whatever structure was directing it. A dead Cross now was a solved problem with an infinite number of unsolved problems remaining behind it. She needed him to act. She needed him to communicate. She needed to watch before she moved. She tracked him into the equipment shed and waited. At 8:32 in the morning, Corporal Leland Webb emerged from the northern edge of the compound. Kate watched him through the scope for 90 seconds before she understood what she was seeing. He was not running a patrol. He was not checking a perimeter. He was moving with the deliberate forward purpose of a man who had a specific destination and was trying to reach it without being seen from the structures behind him. He glanced back every 30 or 40 steps. His route followed the tree line rather than the open ground. He was using the timber for cover. He was not complicit. He was running. Kate made a decision in approximately 2 seconds, which was about as long as she had before he would move out of the corridor her current position provided. She packed the surveillance kit, slung the rifle, and moved. Moving through deep snow on a slope without producing sound was not a natural human skill. It required the redistribution of weight across the entire foot rather than a heel strike, a kind of controlled forward fall that placed each step deliberately and absorbed the impact through bent knees rather than rigid ankles. Exhausting, slow, nearly silent. She moved along the upper slope, paralleling Webb's course at roughly 200 meters, staying inside the tree line where the canopy was dense enough to break the visual plane. He stopped at a cluster of granite boulders on the eastern slope, a natural observation point the team had used during the first week of the mission, and sat down against the largest boulder with his back to the stone and his face toward the outpost below. Kate came up behind him from above. Webb. He came off the rock with both hands raised in a sound that was not quite a word, a compressed, terrified syllable that she recognized as the involuntary vocalization of a man who had been expecting death to come from behind him. Quiet. Hands down. Breathe. He stared at her with the expression she had seen on people who had encountered something they had placed in the category of impossible. The brief, disorienting interval before the mind accepts the revision and updates its understanding of the world. Mercer, his voice barely cleared a whisper. You were in the building. I thought the fire I got out. She stepped closer and lowered her voice further. How many? He understood the question immediately. Cross and Holloway for certain, he said. And I think Sergeant Cassine, based on what I saw last night. He was with them before the fire started. Aldridge and Farrell, I don't know. I don't think so. But I don't know. Aldridge looked genuinely sick when Cross told the group you must have gone out for a walk and not made it back. Farrell looked like a man who couldn't disagree, even if he wanted to. Kate absorbed this. Where are they now? In the ops room when I left. Cross has them running inventory on what was lost in the fire. Where's Casson perimeter check? East Loop access road. Supposed to be at the road by 0900. She checked her watch. 8:49. Go back, she said. Stay close to Aldridge and Farrell. Don't communicate with Cross or Holloway unless you have to. Don't look for me. He nodded once with his entire body. Before he went, he said one more thing. Casson pulled me aside 2 days ago. He wanted to know if there was any way to get a message off the mountain without going through the communications equipment. Without Holloway knowing. He was nervous in a way I hadn't seen before. Wouldn't tell me what it was about. Kate held this. What did you tell him? That I didn't know of a way. He went quiet after that. Stopped meeting my eyes at meals. Webb went back down toward the compound. Kate turned east and began moving toward the access road. She found her position at 8:57, a shelf of scree 40 meters up the eastern slope behind a deadfall spruce that had come down in the autumn and now lay at a diagonal across the hillside. Its root mass provided concealment from below. She settled in, adjusted her breathing, and let the rifle become part of the slope. Through the scope, 400 meters of access road, a pale cut through the dark pines dusted with fresh snow still accumulating in the thin morning light. She thought about Dwight Casson. She had known him for 12 days. He was 31 years old with a wife in Billings, whose photograph he had shown her on the second day here unprompted, with the quality of a man who needed to establish that something warm and real existed somewhere outside this mountain. She had found it more touching than she expected. He moved with the slightly distracted energy of someone performing a familiar task in conditions that discouraged enthusiasm. He had a manner of tilting his head slightly when he was thinking that made him look younger than he was. Cross was down there with 4 remaining personnel, and Webb had said Cassine was one of the 3 he believed to be complicit. But Webb had also told her that 2 days ago Cassine had been looking for a way to get a message off the mountain without Cross knowing. These 2 facts sat beside each other in her mind without resolving. The access road was empty. She waited. Specialist Dwight Casson appeared on the road at 9:08. Moving south along the western edge with his rifle on a 3-point sling, attention divided between the tree line and the ground in front of him. his breath fogged in the cold. Kate tracked him through the scope, 212 meters. Wind 4 knots out of the northeast steady for the past 45 minutes. At this distance, a 4-knot crosswind moved the round approximately 3 centimeters off center, if left uncorrected. Kate corrected automatically the way she had been correcting for variables of this magnitude, since before correcting for them had required conscious thought. She followed Cassin's progress down the road. He stopped. He stood still for a moment, and then he looked around. Not the practiced scan of a soldier covering a sector. Something else. Something that belonged to a private moment rather than a military task. He looked at the tree line at the road ahead at the sky above the western ridge. Then he raised one hand, not toward anything, not in surrender, not signaling to anyone present. He raised his right hand to approximately shoulder height and held it there for 2 or 3 seconds. A gesture directed at nothing, aimed at no one, offered to the cold air above the access road, as though he were trying to stop something that was not coming from any particular direction. Kate watched this through the scope. She understood she was watching a man say something to an audience that was not there in a language that had no words. Her finger was on the trigger. She had been in enough positions over enough years to know that the moment she was in did not permit the luxury of extended interpretation. She had the information she had at 9:11 in the morning on December 15th. She did not have the information she would have an hour from now or a day from now. The operational logic of her situation was clear, and had been clear since the moment she dropped into the drainage channel the night before. The shot broke at 9:11, 212 meters. Wind 4 knots, conditions exactly as calculated. Cassin went down at the road's edge. Kate worked the bolt and settled back into stillness. Not the marksmanship which was geometry in practice, but this. The ability to remain completely motionless and completely present in the silence after an action that could not be taken back for as long as it took the world to become legible again. She heard eventually voices from the direction of the compound, the ragged, uncontained quality of men who had lost their professional composure. She did not move. She lay in the snow behind the deadfall spruce, and she thought about a mailing address in Billings, Montana. About a photograph shown to a stranger on a cold afternoon because a man needed to remember that something warm existed somewhere. About a hand raised toward nothing. About what it meant to carry something that had no word for itself. Not guilt, not innocence. The weight of a decision made correctly with the information available that was wrong anyway, that could not be undone, and that would not stop being wrong no matter how cleanly the reasoning held. The wind moved through the canopy above her. The cold pressed down. She stayed where she was and let the weight find the shape it was going to take. She had learned years ago that this was the only honest response to it. Not resolve it, not explain it away. Let it find its shape and then carry it the way you carried anything that could not be put down. 4 targets remained. Cross, Holloway. Victor Hale, the apex contractor she had identified during the first week of surveillance. Former Army Ranger, 44 years old. Operating under the cover designation of a site logistics coordinator. She had watched him move through the compound for 12 days with the unhurried efficiency of a man whose training had not atrophied, and the question of Owen Farrell. She waited until the voices below reached the road and began organizing themselves into something resembling a search pattern. Then she moved back into the tree line, heading north along the upper slope. The mountain was large. She was small on the side of it. But she had been here 12 days, and she had spent every one of those days studying this terrain the way she studied everything she might need to survive. And survival, she had learned long ago, was not about being the strongest or the fastest or the most capable in any absolute sense. It was about knowing more about where you were standing than the person trying to move you from it. She knew where she was standing. She moved north through the timber and did not look back at the road. The sound of men who have lost their composure carried differently than the sound of men who were simply loud. Kate had learned this distinction early in her career in the way the body learned things rather than the mind. There was the controlled noise of a unit executing a plan, under pressure, voices, clipped and purposeful movement organized by training into something that resembled geometry even when the geometry was wrong. And then there was the other thing, the ragged, uncontained quality of voices that had stopped being professional and started being frightened. The sound of a group of people discovering that the situation they were managing had become a situation that was managing them. From 200 meters up the eastern slope, moving through the first row of timber below the ridgeline crest, Kate could hear both kinds of sound and the voices rising from the access road. Cross was still professional. She could distinguish his voice by its flatness, its refusal to admit register. Holloway was not. There was something in Holloway's voice that had slipped past the boundary of control into territory where the vocal cords simply reported what the nervous system was doing rather than what the brain had authorized. She did not stop to listen. She had already extracted what she needed from the acoustic environment below. The search pattern they were establishing would cover the access road and the lower eastern slope first. They would not expect her to move upslope and north. They would expect, if they expected anything at all, that she had gone for the logging road, that she was trying to get out. They were wrong about that too. By 10:40 in the morning, she had established a new position on the western slope, 320 meters above the compound, on a shelf of granite behind a dense cluster of Engelmann spruce that had grown together closely enough to create a natural blind from below. She could observe the ops room, the communications building, and the narrow gap between them where the covered walkway connected the two structures. She could also observe Nora Aldridge. Aldridge had come out of the ops room at 10:15. She walked slowly toward the burned footprint of the bunkhouse, stopped twice without apparent reason, and crouched at the edge of the burned area. She stayed there for a long time, not examining anything, not cataloging, just crouching at the edge of what the fire had left and looking at it with the stillness of a person trying to process something the mind was not yet ready to organize into its proper shape. Kate watched this from 320 meters with the scope and with the specific understanding that came from having experienced the same thing herself in different configurations. Aldridge was in the interval before the architecture of grief had been built, before the mind had taken the raw material of a terrible fact and constructed around it the understanding that eventually made it possible to continue. She carried it the way innocent people carried loss, with the full weight distributed across the entire body. Nothing managed, nothing contained. The complicit did not grieve like that. The complicit were too occupied with the mechanics of what they had done to surrender completely to the mass of the consequence. Kate made a decision there that required no deliberation. Aldridge was not part of this. She turned the scope toward the ops room. Through the narrow gap of the doorway, she could see Lieutenant Owen Farrell seated at the central table, not moving, just sitting. The posture of a man who had been asked to wait and was discovering that waiting under these circumstances required a kind of endurance that the body was not designed to sustain indefinitely. She thought about the half-second pause he inserted before every sentence. She had cataloged it as a communication habit during the first week. A man choosing between two versions of the truth and almost always choosing neither. She had read it as caution. She was beginning to read it differently. It was the pause of a man holding something that had weight. Who had been holding it since before this mission began? She filed this and returned to watching. At 10:30 in the morning, Cross ordered Farrell to search the northern sector. Kate watched through the scope. Cross stood in the ops room doorway and said something. Farrell stood, adjusted his jacket, picked up his rifle, and moved in the direction of the northern perimeter. Kate shifted position to maintain the sight line. She watched him for 18 minutes. At the first bend in the northern perimeter path where the trail curved toward a stand of lodgepole pine that provided natural concealment from the ops room windows, Farrell's pace dropped to approximately 70% of what it had been on the open ground. His route through the northern sector looked from a distance like a standard perimeter search. It was not. Kate had walked that sector herself 4 times in the 12 days. She knew where the ground showed disturbance easiest, where snow compacted under weight, in a way that held a track for hours, which angles of approach would reveal recent movement and which would not. Farrell was covering this sector in precisely the configuration that would miss all of it, not randomly, with a specificity that could only exist if the person conducting it knew exactly what they were trying not to find. 20 minutes in, his radio crackled, Cross asking for a status report. Farrell's voice came back flat and even. Nothing to find up here. Kate held the scope on him as he said it. She watched the way his body held the radio, the way his chin dropped slightly after the transmission ended, the way he stood for a moment in the lodgepole timber before turning back toward the compound. She had seen that posture before on different people in different places. The posture of a man who had just done something he did not believe in and who was absorbing the weight of having done it again. Webb had told her that Apex had approached Farrell before the mission began, that they had something on him from a previous deployment, something small enough to be survivable in ordinary circumstances, large enough to be devastating in the right hands. She did not need to know the specific nature of it. The mechanism was the same regardless of the particulars. You found the thing a person could not afford to lose, and you made it contingent on their cooperation, and then you called it an arrangement and waited for the arrangement to compound itself into something that no longer required maintenance because the person inside it had lost the ability to imagine an alternative. Farrell had not killed anyone, had not planned anything, had not been the architect of what happened in the bunkhouse. But he had known, and he had been here inside the knowledge for 9 days before the fire, and he had said nothing. Kate watched him walk back toward the ops room. She thought about the line between the man who held the match and the man who stood at the window and said nothing and told himself he had no choice. She had spent enough time in enough difficult places to know that line was rarely as clean as people who had never been near it believed it to be. But she also knew that clean or not, the line existed. It always did. She turned the scope north and began thinking about the afternoon. At 12:15, the storm arrived. It did not announce itself. Kate had noted the cloud formations to the northwest during the early morning hours, the stacking and density that in this range typically preceded a front moving through. She had noted it and then returned her attention to the compound and the people within it, and by the time the wind doubled in speed and shifted direction from northeast to northwest, she had been too focused on other information to have acted on what the sky had been telling her. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in 30 minutes. Snow that had been falling vertically became horizontal, cutting visibility in the open to 60 meters and less in the timber. The old growth above the compound began to speak in long, articulate creaking under lateral load. Kate adjusted. A blizzard in the Bitterroot Range was not a condition that negated her operational capacity. It was a condition that changed it. The reduction in visibility worked in both directions. The men below could not see into the tree line any better than she could see out of it. But she had spent 12 days studying this specific terrain from the ground up, and they had not, and the asymmetry of that knowledge was in a storm worth more than firepower. She began moving along the western slope, descending in a controlled traverse that stayed inside the first row of timber where the canopy broke some of the horizontal snow. She navigated by the landmarks she had memorized over 12 days of deliberate study. A split boulder at the 250-meter mark, a dry watercourse below the granite shelf, the deadfall cluster that marked the transition from dense canopy to more open slope. The storm gave her a cover. The storm also gave her a target. At 12:47, Trent Holloway emerged from the ops room. He was moving with purpose, faster than any routine task demanded, heading toward the equipment shed along the east side of the compound. The storm reduced him to a shape in reduced visibility, but she had been watching him long enough to read his movement by its silhouette alone. The slightly forward lean, the way his right arm swung slightly wider than necessary when his left hand was occupied with something he was protecting from the elements. Kate was 140 meters away and closing. Using the noise of the storm as cover for movement she could not have made in quieter conditions, she worked down the slope and found a position behind a granite outcropping at the edge of the tree line that gave her a clear angle across the open ground between the ops room and the equipment shed. The wind was strong and variable, gusting in ways that changed the ballistic calculation, continuously shifting the effective point of impact in increments that needed to be read in real time rather than calculated in advance. She spent 45 seconds reading the storm, watching the snow drive and eddy around the corner of the ops room, feeling the pressure differentials against her own body as each gust built and subsided, timing the intervals between the worst pulses. There was a rough periodicity in the gusts, not a steady rhythm, but a pattern with enough regularity to work with. 12 to 15 seconds between the peaks of the strongest sequences, a lull of 3 to 4 seconds at the bottom of each cycle. She identified the next lull by the feel of the pressure against her left cheek and the sound of the wind in the canopy above dropping half a register. She fired during the lull. The round struck 2 inches right of the intended point of impact. A wind shift in the last fraction of a second had moved it. It did not matter. At 140 meters, 2 inches in most directions was within the geometry of the problem. Holloway went down in the open ground between the ops room and the equipment shed. She did not watch him fall for more than a second. She was already reading the next phase of the storm, already calculating where the next problem was. It came 40 seconds later. Derek Moss appeared in the doorway of the equipment shed. He stood in the frame of the door, his silhouette backlit completely by the dim interior light behind him, which solved the problem of reduced visibility in a single configuration. He was scanning the open ground, looking toward Holloway, looking toward the tree line, looking for the source of something he had heard or sensed in the acoustic environment of the storm. He stood in the doorway for 2 seconds. Kate fired from 90 meters, adjusting for the near-zero wind shadow that the equipment shed's wall created on the eastern side. The shed blocked the dominant wind direction completely. The round required almost no correction. Moss dropped in the doorway. Kate was already moving north up the slope before the echo of the second shot had been consumed by the storm. 60 meters up, she stopped, checked her ammunition, controlled her breathing, let the storm press down over everything below her. Holloway, Moss, two names, two fewer problems between her and the hard-sided case that Cross was carrying somewhere in the compound below. Cross and Victor Hale remained, and the question of Owen Farrell's exact position in all of this. In 2 hours and 13 minutes until extraction point Delta was scheduled for 1600. She had ammunition for considerably longer than that. She had patience for longer still. What she did not have was the hard-sided case, which was somewhere inside the ops room, with a man who had just been told that 2 more of his people were down, and who would now understand clearly that the situation had moved far beyond anything he had planned for. She needed to be in position before he moved. She checked her ammunition a second time. Then she began moving north through the timber toward the communications building, circling wide and staying below the crest of the ridgeline where the wind would carry her silhouette away from anyone watching from below. She had time. She intended to use it correctly. At 1:18 in the afternoon, she intercepted a radio transmission on the Apex operational frequency. She had been running the passive intercept unit since the storm began monitoring the frequency she had been tracking for 12 days. Most of what it had captured in that time was routine operational traffic, logistics, personnel schedules, equipment checks, the kind of traffic that told her what was happening without telling her why it mattered. This transmission was different. The external voice was the same processed male voice she had heard before. It had always carried the quality of someone operating from a position of authority in a context that cost them nothing personally. Now the processing could not entirely disguise what had moved past controlled into something else. Confirm status. We have no contact from Holloway or Moss. Confirm status. Static. Then Cross. This is Cross. We have a significant problem. Define significant. The subject did not terminate. She is currently active. We have lost Casson Holloway and Moss. A silence on the frequency that lasted long enough that Kate began to wonder if the connection had dropped. Then quietly, with a precision that was more unsettling than anger would have been, "How is that possible?" She got out of the building. Another silence shorter. Cross. The extraction cannot be compromised. The licensing renewal is contingent on this site being clean. The authorization in Washington depends on a clean preliminary survey. If this unravels, I understand what's at stake. His voice had changed. She heard it and filed it. Something had shifted beneath the words, a quality she could not name precisely but recognized. I will handle it. You said that 12 hours ago. The frequency went to static. Kate lay in the snow on the upper slope and turned this over. She thought about what she had heard. Washington, authorization at the federal level, a licensing renewal contingent on a clean site. She thought about what Apex Resource Group was doing in the Bitterroot Valley under a federal extraction license. The stated purpose was a preliminary survey for rare earth mineral deposits. The extraction rights beneath this valley represented approximately $4 billion over a 20-year cycle. The federal license that would make those rights actionable required a preliminary survey that came back with the right results. The survey would come back with the right results because the people producing it were the same people who would benefit from those results. That was the structure of the thing on the operational end. Clean, circular, dependent on no one asking the wrong questions. But there was a layer above that structure. Someone in Washington who had moved the necessary authorizations through the necessary channels. Someone with the institutional access to turn a preliminary federal license into a permanent extraction agreement. The information in Cross's hard-sided case connected that name to everything that had happened in this valley. She added this to what she was carrying and began moving north. At 1:47, 4 figures converged on the open ground near the access road. Kate observed them from a position on the upper eastern ridgeline, the scope steady. The storm was easing slightly, visibility extending to perhaps 80 meters in the open. She identified them. Cross. Hale moving with the efficiency of someone calculating options and not yet settling on one. A third figure from Apex, one of the peripheral personnel she had cataloged during surveillance. And Owen Farrell. Farrell's body language was entirely different from the others. Not the controlled agitation of men managing a tactical problem. The off-balance quality of someone who had just been told something that had reorganized his understanding of where he was standing and had not yet had time to rebuild his equilibrium. He stood at the edge of the group rather than inside it. She watched Cross speak. She could read the body language of command at this distance without hearing the words. The economy of gesture of a man accustomed to having his words produce movement in other people. Farrell took 3 steps backward. not a retreat. The 3 steps of a man who needed physical distance from what he had just heard in order to process it. Kate had learned to read posture at distance the way other people read facial expressions, because at the distances she worked faces were small and postures were large, and posture did not lie in the same ways that faces sometimes did. Farrell was deciding something. She watched him make the decision, watched it happen in the shift of his weight, the drop of his chin, the slight rotation of his shoulders. He turned and walked back toward the ops room. Not running, walking with the deliberate pace of a man who needed to hold himself together for the length of the distance between where he was and where he was going. She tracked him until the door closed behind him. Then she tracked back to Cross. He was speaking quietly to Hale. Hale was listening with the rapid abbreviated nods of a man receiving orders and working to project a confidence he did not entirely feel. Cross put a hand on Hale's shoulder, a gesture that, from this distance, looked almost paternal. Then he turned and looked at the tree line. He looked for a long time. Kate was 160 meters away, perfectly still, buried in the shadow and snow beneath an overhanging Douglas fir. She watched him look. She understood with complete clarity that if Cross had been a different kind of man, one who trusted the evidence of what he could not see as much as the evidence of what he could, he would have been afraid at this moment. The mathematics of the afternoon would have told him that something in the tree line was methodical and patient and knew this terrain better than anyone in the compound below. Instead, she watched him make the mistake of men who relied too heavily on their own competence. He looked at the tree line, found nothing he could identify as a threat, and turned away. She noted this. Cross and Hale moved back toward the compound. Kate lay still in her depression and let them go. She was not going to take Cross in the open. There was still the matter of the hard-sided case and what it contained. A dead Cross in the snow outside the ops room solved one problem and potentially destroyed the only physical evidence connecting Apex Resource Group to the authorization chain that ran from this valley to a federal office in Washington. She needed the case. To get the case intact, she needed Cross in an enclosed space where the geometry of the situation was confined enough to reduce his options to something she could manage. She thought about the layout of the communications building. The narrow horizontal window on the north face with the hinged corner that had been warped since day 3. The covered walkway connecting it to the ops room, which Cross would use when he moved toward Extraction Point Delta, because any man who had survived 25 years of operational service would not walk through the open ground where 3 of his people had been shot inside of 6 hours. He would use the walkway. She knew when he would use it. She knew where she would be when he did. She began moving north along the upper slope, circling wide through the timber toward the north side of the communications building. The afternoon light was beginning to fail the pewter sky, darkening at its edges, towards something closer to charcoal. In an hour, the temperature would drop another 6 degrees. In 2 hours, the storm would either peak or diminish, and the window for the extraction at Delta would open or close depending on which one it did. Kate moved through the timber and did not rush. Rushing was for people who had not already decided where they were going to be and how long they were willing to stay there. She had decided. She had the patience for it. She had been doing this for 14 years. The north wall of this communications building was 12 feet of cold-pressed machine over a frame of steel studs, and it held the temperature of the air around it, the way stone held cold completely and without negotiation. Kate approached it from the northwest, coming down through the drainage she had mapped on day 4, staying below the ridgeline until the last 80 meters where the canopy thinned and she needed to move in the open. She was 40 meters from the north wall when she heard movement at the southeast corner of the equipment shed. Not the sound of a man performing a task. The sound of a man trying not to be heard performing a task, which was a different sound entirely. Compressed and careful and betrayed by the quality of effort that silence required, when the person attempting it was afraid. She stopped. The figure came around the corner of the equipment shed, moving fast and low, a hard-sided case under his right arm and a pack over his left shoulder. He was moving northwest, which was the direction of the northern access trail, which connected after 600 meters to the secondary logging road running along the upper eastern valley. The road that did not appear on the command maps, but that a man with 12 days of operational presence in this valley and a reason to leave it without using the primary extraction point would know existed. Victor Hale, 44 years old, former Army Ranger, current Senior Logistics Coordinator for Apex Resource Group, which was the title on the cover documentation, and bore approximately the same relationship to his actual function as the title site surveyor bore to the 3 Apex personnel who had spent 12 days in this valley documenting the precise mineral composition of the ground beneath it. He was 8 meters from the tree line when Kate stepped out of it. He stopped. The hard case swung forward from the momentum of his aborted movement, and he caught it against his body. His eyes went from her face to the rifle and back to her face with the rapid assessment of a man whose training was telling him to calculate and whose nervous system was telling him something that overrode the calculation. He had been a ranger. He understood geometry. He understood the geometry of this particular configuration, which was a woman with a rifle at 12 meters in open ground with nothing between them. He set the case down. The motion was slow and deliberate and communicated everything it needed to communicate about his decision. "Hands," Kate said. He raised them. She moved toward him at an angle that kept the rifle in a firing position without closing the distance faster than she wanted to. At 6 meters, she stopped. "Where are you going?" He looked at her for a moment. He had the face of a man who had been running contingency plans since before the first shot of the afternoon and had just watched the last viable contingency reduce itself to this conversation. "Away," he said. "Before Cross figures out that I'm more useful to whoever is looking into this than I am to him." She looked at him, then at the case. "That's not the hard drive case from the ops room." No, his voice was even the voice of a man who had decided that being useful was now his best available option. "That one stays with Cross. It has a deletion protocol running. Activated this morning at 0900. 6 hours from activation, the drive wipes itself and the embedded key is destroyed. After 1500, whatever is on that drive is gone permanently." She checked her watch. 1411. 49 minutes. "Only Cross has the access code," Hale continued. "That was the arrangement. One man, one point of failure. He built it that way so that no one in the chain could compel access without going through him directly." Kate processed this. The hard-sided case she needed was in the communications building, accessible only through a conversation with the man who had designed the deletion timer and had locked her in a burning building 14 hours ago. A man who was somewhere in the compound below, with a rifle and 25 years of training, and the specific motivation of someone who understood that his situation had reduced itself to a set of options that were all variations of bad. She needed him in an enclosed space. She needed to reach the communications building before he moved toward extraction. She took the zip tie from her survival kit and secured Hale's wrists to the exterior drain pipe on the north wall of the equipment shed. The pipe was half-inch galvanized steel bolted to a concrete footing. He was not going to move it. He did not resist. The compliance of a man who had already completed the calculation. The case, she said, nodding toward the one he had set down. "Communications records," he said. "Internal Apex traffic from the past 6 months. Names, amounts, dates. Corroborates everything on Cross's drive independently." "Take it." She picked it up. "If Cross doesn't make it out of this," Hale said, "you still need the code from somewhere." She looked at him. His son's birthday. Cross mentioned it once in a context where I don't think he realized I was cataloging it. October 3rd, 2002. He said it the way someone said something they had filed, because in this kind of work, information you were not supposed to have was the only insurance that reliably paid out. Kate picked up both cases, turned toward the north wall of the communications building. The hinged corner of the window shutter on the north face pulled back at an angle that left an opening she could fit 4 fingers through. She had noticed it on day 3 when she was conducting her initial structural assessment of the compound, cataloging every point of entry and exit, every place where the building was not entirely what it appeared to be. The frame had contracted in the cold. She pulled the shutter with steady, continuous pressure, letting the resistance tell her where the friction was and working around it. The shutter opened without sound. She went through in one movement, controlled and low, and landed on the floor of the communications building in a crouch. The interior was lit by emergency lighting, a dim red-orange glow from battery-backed fixtures that gave the room the quality of a place existing in a state between operational and abandoned. Radio banks along the south wall, encryption terminals, power conditioners, all of it running on the low-power backup cycle that kept the equipment from freezing without drawing enough current to signal activity on the main generator. She oriented herself in 6 seconds. The door to the covered walkway was on the east wall, the main entrance on the south wall. The window she had entered was behind her to the north. She moved to the east wall and flattened herself against it to the right side of the door connecting to the covered walkway. She set both cases down quietly against the base of the wall. She checked her sidearm. Full magazine, round in the chamber. She checked her watch. 14:19, 41 minutes. She waited. Waiting was the thing that people who had never done her work consistently underestimated. Not the marksmanship which could be taught to most people with enough repetition and the right instruction. Not the fieldcraft which was a catalog of skills that could be learned and made automatic with sufficient time. The waiting was the thing that separated the people who could do this work from the people who believed they could and discovered otherwise the first time they needed to hold a position for longer than the body wanted to cooperate. She had held a position for 19 hours once, in conditions that were worse than this in most measurable respects. She had emerged from it with clear eyes and steady hands. This was not 19 hours. This was 32 minutes. She stood against the east wall of the communications building in the red-orange glow of the emergency lighting and breathed at the rate she used during extended observation and listened to the storm work its way through the timber above the compound and did not move. At 14:23, she heard footsteps on the covered walkway. One set, heavy, controlled, not hurried. The footsteps of a man who was keeping his heart rate down through conscious effort rather than because there was nothing to keep it down about. She knew the weight and rhythm of those footsteps. She had been listening to them for 3 years in corridors, and on gravel, and on wooden stairs, and on the frozen ground of forward operating bases in places that did not appear on public maps. The door opened. Cross came through carrying the hard-sided case in his right hand and his rifle slung over his left shoulder, which meant his right hand was occupied, and his left arm was positioned across his body in a way that made it slower to bring to use than if the rifle had been on his right. She had noted which shoulder he used before he stepped into her sight line because she had been watching his shadow move through the gap at the bottom of the door for 15 seconds before it opened. He took 2 steps into the communications building. Then he stopped. Not because he had seen her. She was against the wall to the right of the doorway. In the deepest shadow, the emergency lighting left position at an angle outside the natural visual sweep of a person entering from the walkway. He had not seen her. He had felt the room. 25 years of operational service had given Daniel Cross the capacity to read the quality of enclosed spaces. A sensitivity calibrated by enough close calls to respond to the difference between a room that was empty and a room that only appeared to be. The pressure was different. The temperature distribution was different in a way below the threshold of conscious perception, but not below the threshold of a nervous system trained to notice exactly this kind of variation. He set the case down, slowly and deliberately, a man who had moved from forward progress into assessment. Kate said one word from the shadow behind him and to his left. Don't. He went completely still. The word had arrived from exactly where his training would have told him was the worst possible direction behind and at an angle that closed off his strongest side and made any movement. He initiated a movement away from the threat rather than toward it. She watched his shoulders settle slightly as he processed the geometry of what had happened and moved from the category of potential action into the category of assessment. He ran the calculation. She watched him run it, watched him arrive at what the calculation produced. The calculation produced nothing useful. Kate, his voice was steady, not a greeting, an acknowledgement. He was not talking to a soldier in this moment. He was talking to a person. She understood the distinction and set it to one side. Set the rifle down. He set it down, lowering it to the floor until it rested against the south wall. Turn around, he turned. In the red-orange glow of the emergency lighting, his face was readable to her in the way it could only be after 3 years. She saw the calculation she had expected. She saw a resignation that was partial, the resignation of a man who had accepted one outcome but had not fully foreclosed on the others. And she saw something that occupied the space where other things might have been. Something not quite regret in the ordinary sense. Not the regret of a man who wished he had not done what he had done, but the regret of a man who could see clearly the distance between the person he had been and the person the last 12 months had made him, and who understood that distance was not crossable in the time remaining. She held the sidearm steady at the center of his chest. The Apex people will be at Delta by 1600, he said. If they don't hear from me in the next 40 minutes, they will assume the operation is burned and extract. You won't get them. I know, he paused. That doesn't concern you. They're contractors. They'll be found by people with more institutional patience than me and more resources to follow the authorization chain to its end. She kept the weapon steady. I'm not here for them. He looked at her for a moment. Then why not take the shot from the tree line? You had me at 40 meters when I crossed to the walkway entrance. Because I need what's in that case, she said. And I need it intact. And there's a timer running that only you can stop. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. The expression of a man who had built a mechanism specifically so it could not be bypassed and who was now standing in front of the one person who had found the only way around it. The deletion protocol, he said. Activated at 0900, she said. 40 minutes left. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her. The federal survey data. Complete. All 12 days of observation logs from Apex's ground teams. Every communication record between Apex Resource Group and the Senate Commerce Subcommittee. The full financial structure of the licensing agreement, including the payment records connecting the approval chain to Senator Gerald Hatch's office in Washington. Hatch's office specifically. 3 members of his staff with signatory authority over the preliminary license. 2 external legal entities used to structure the payments. The original internal Apex memo dated with sender and distribution list describing the need to ensure the military observation element at Firebase Kestrel was removed before the preliminary survey results were submitted to the Federal Licensing Board. The memo describing the removal specifically. In those words, he said, in writing. Kate absorbed this. This was not a corrupt military officer in a resource extraction company operating under a fraudulent license. This was the documentation of a federal official using institutional authority to authorize a private criminal operation and then using that same authority to suppress the observation that would have exposed it. The kind of thing that moved through the Department of Justice and 3 separate federal courts and took years to resolve and cost people things that money could not restore. The kind of thing that needed to be intact to do any of that. The passcode. He said it without hesitation. His son's date of birth. October 3rd, 2002. Kate picked up the hard-sided case from the floor without taking the weapon off cross, set it on the nearest equipment rack, entered the passcode. The screen confirmed deactivation of the deletion timer. 1434. She set the case back down. Then she looked at Cross. Aldridge, she said. Clean, no knowledge of the operation or its purpose. She conducted herself accordingly throughout. Farrell, a pause. Not the half-second pause she had learned to read in Farrell himself. Something longer. Cross was being precise. Farrell was approached 9 days before the mission began. Apex had documentation of a financial irregularity from a previous deployment, small in absolute terms, sufficient to end his career if disclosed. He was given a choice that was not genuinely a choice, and he made the only decision the situation permitted him. He was never briefed on the full operational plan. He did not know about the fire in advance. And Webb. Cross looked at her with the expression of a man choosing how to say the next thing. Webb is a good man, he said. He did everything right, everything he was supposed to do. He stopped. Something was changing in his breathing. The shallow, controlled rhythm of a man managing a significant wound through discipline rather than panic. A man who had been around enough serious injury to know that panic accelerated the thing he was trying to slow down. She had been watching for this since the shot. Kate, he said. She waited. The window, the one on the west wall of the bunkhouse. He stopped. Took a breath that cost him more than it should have. I noticed it on day 3. The frame had contracted in the cold. There was a gap at the lower left corner, the width of a hand. The foam insulation was in the equipment shed. I could have sealed it in 5 minutes. He looked at her. I didn't seal it. Kate stood in the emergency lighting of the communications building and looked at Daniel Cross. The man who had recruited her and trained her and walked into a firefight without being asked and then designed a rotation schedule that left her alone in a burning building. Who had set a timer on the only evidence that could hold the people behind this accountable and then given her the code to that timer in the first 30 seconds of the conversation? Who had noticed a gap in a window frame on day 3 and chosen not to fill it and carried that choice for 11 days without saying anything to anyone? She thought about what it cost to leave something open when it would have been easier and safer and strategically simpler to close it. Not the small cost of 5 minutes in a can of foam insulation. The other cost. The cost of admitting in the only language available to a man who could not say it in words that he was not fully willing to follow the decision he had made to its logical end. That there was a version of this he could accept and a version he could not, and the version he could not was the one where she never had a chance at all. It was not redemption. She understood that clearly and without sentiment. A gap in a window frame did not balance against a padlock on a door. The mathematics of what had happened in this compound over the past 18 hours did not resolve into something clean because of a piece of warped wood and a decision not to get the foam insulation. But it was information, and it told her something about the man in front of her that the rest of the information did not tell her. Something that existed alongside everything else without canceling it, the way things that were true about people always existed alongside all the other things that were also true about them. She picked up the hard-sided case with her left hand. She picked up the Apex Communications case. She looked at Cross one more time. He was sitting with his back against the radio bank and his legs in front of him on the metal grid floor. His hands still in the position they had been in since she told him to put them down, breathing in the shallow rhythm of a man doing what he could with what remained. She did not fire again. She moved to the north door and opened it and stepped through into the cold. The storm had dropped to a light and steady snowfall by the time she reached the upper slope. She climbed to the granite shelf above the compound and sat down with the rifle across her knees and both cases beside her, and she looked at the valley below. Firebase Kestrel was a small cluster of structures in the bottom of the depression between the ridgelines. The ops room and the communications building and the equipment tree shed and the burned rectangle where the bunkhouse had been already gathering new snow on the surface of the char. From this elevation, they appeared as the things they were: temporary, improvised, already in the process of being reclaimed by the landscape that had always owned the ground beneath them. She thought about the shape of the day, about Holloway and Moss lying in the open ground between the buildings, about Dwight Casson at the edge of the access road with a mailing address in Billings, and a photograph of his wife in a number she had given to the right person so that a letter could eventually be sent that no letter was adequate to send. About Victor Hale secured to a drain pipe waiting. About Owen Farrell somewhere in the compound below, carrying 9 days of silence that he would be carrying for a great deal longer than 9 days before the institutional processes that handled these things were finished with him. At 15:30, she used the passive radio unit to establish one-way contact with Webb. His voice came back quiet and steady. "We're in the comms building. All three of us. Armed, doors barricaded, waiting." She told him the situation was contained. She told him to stay inside with Aldridge and Farrell and keep the door barricaded until the weather cleared for extraction. She told him there was a man secured to the drain pipe on the north side of the equipment shed who needed to be watched from a distance until someone came to deal with him properly. She did not tell him about Cross. That information would find its proper form in a secure room in Missoula in the morning, with the right people present and the documentation on a table between them. Her job was to deliver it intact. At 1700, the storm peaked and began to diminish. She could see it happening above the western ridge, the cloud mass breaking in a long horizontal seam that admitted a narrow band of winter light. Not warm, not comforting. Simply genuine, the light of something that existed regardless of what was happening beneath it. She picked up the survival radio. "This is Sergeant First Class Kate Mercer, Firebase Kestrel, Bitterroot Range, Montana. I have a confirmed hostile action against a United States military reconnaissance element. I have 3 surviving friendlies in the communications building. I have confirmed casualties. I have materials of significant intelligence value. Request immediate extraction and command notification. Authorization code follows." She read the code from memory. "I will repeat this transmission at 30-minute intervals until acknowledged." She transmitted twice more before the response came. A calm, professional voice reading from a display somewhere warm. "Sergeant Mercer, transmission received and authenticated. Extraction is en route. Estimated time of arrival 90 minutes. Maintain current position." She laid the rifle across her knees and looked at the valley and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in 21 hours. The helicopter came from the south at 1847. 3 points of light moving against the darkening sky, growing from the distance into something with mass and sound until the rotors were audible over the wind and then louder than everything else. It set down in the cleared area near the equipment shed. A figure in tactical gear cleared the aircraft and moved toward the communications building. Kate watched from the ridge. Watched the figure meet Webb at the door. Watched the brief exchange of a situation report being delivered. Watched Webb point toward the equipment shed and then toward the ridgeline. The figure looked up. Kate stood, fully upright, fully visible, against the last light with the rifle on her shoulder and both cases in her left hand. She stood for 4 minutes. Not because she needed to confirm the situation was safe. She had confirmed that before she stood. She stood because, after 21 hours of being a shape in shadow and snow, a presence that existed entirely in its effects rather than its visibility, she needed to be a person again. A specific person standing on a specific piece of ground intact. Then she began walking down the slope. The debrief took place the following morning in a secure room in Missoula. The room had no windows and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly more institutional than it needed to be. A table with a water pitcher and 4 chairs, and a recording unit positioned at the center with the indicator light running. Colonel Patricia Wynne sat across from Kate. She was 61 years old and had overseen long-range reconnaissance operations in the Northwest region for 9 years. She had a reputation for asking exactly the right question and then waiting exactly as long as necessary for the answer, which sometimes meant waiting through silences that made other people in the room uncomfortable. She made Kate comfortable. 2 other people at the table, names and affiliations given at the beginning of the session, part of the institutional machinery. They had their function. Her function was to give them everything she had and trust the process to do what processes did. Kate answered every question fully and without editing. She described the observation mission and its parameters, the signs of internal compromise that Webb had first identified, the fire in the padlock, and the 2 figures at the tree line and the drainage channel, and the slope, and the granite shelf in the dark. She described the morning, Cassine on the access road, the gesture, the shot at 9/11, the mailing address in Billings. She described Holloway in the storm, Moss in the doorway, the intercept of Cross's radio communication with the Apex chain of command. She described finding Hale behind the equipment shed, the deletion timer, the zip tie on the drain pipe, and the code she had already known. She described the communications building, the sidearm, the conversation, the passcode, and the timer, and what the hard-sided case contained. She described the decision she made when she walked out the north door. Wynne listened without interruption. When Kate finished, Wynne looked at her with the expression of someone taking the measure of a thing before deciding what to say about it. The extraction unit found Cross alive, she said, transported to a hospital in Spokane, currently in surgical recovery. His initial statements corroborate the documentary record in both cases. Kate received this without visible reaction. The authorization chain, Wynne continued, runs in the direction the documentation describes. 6 individuals with direct financial relationships to Apex Resource Group. 3 with signatory authority over the federal licensing mechanism. Senator Hatch's office has been formally notified that it is the subject of a Department of Justice inquiry. She paused. The preliminary indication is that the relevant parties are not planning to cooperate voluntarily. They rarely do. Wynne set down her pen. Farrell, she said, he has retained counsel and submitted a voluntary statement. The statement is consistent with what you've described. The blackmail documentation from Apex corroborates his account of how he was approached and what he was told. The JAG office is reviewing it. She paused. He will not face a court-martial. He will face other things. Kate understood what other things meant, not prison. The slower, quieter accounting of a man who would spend the rest of his career, however long it lasted, knowing exactly where the line between coercion and complicity ran, and knowing which side of it he had stood on when it mattered. Some consequences did not require a courtroom. They simply required a mirror. Wynne looked at Kate across the table. He asked about you, she said. Kate waited. Cross, he asked before they moved him into surgery. He said to tell you that the window was not an accident. Kate looked at the surface of the table for a moment. The fluorescent light made the grain of the wood look flat and even. I know, she said. Wynne nodded once. She reached across and rested her hand briefly on the hard-sided case. You need medical attention for the shoulder and the burn before anything else happens, she said. After that, we'll talk about what comes next. Kate stood. Her left shoulder moved through the range of motion required to push the chair back, and it communicated its opinion of this in the way it had been communicating since the drainage channel. The burn on her forearm pulled with every movement, the resistance of tissue being asked to do more than it was ready for. She picked up neither case. Both of them belonged to someone else now, to the institutional machinery and the people who operated it. That was what they were for. She walked out of the secure room and into the corridor. Outside the corridor was the institutional gray of a federal building in winter. At the far end, a set of double doors with narrow windows showed the outside. Kate walked toward the light. She thought about Dwight Casson, not about the shot. She had thought about the shot through the night on the mountain and on the helicopter, and in the early hours in a Missoula room that smelled of cleaning products and nothing else. She had thought about it until it had found the shape it was going to take. Not guilt in the way that word was commonly used. Not innocence. The weight that lived in the space between a decision that was operationally correct and a consequence that was morally permanent. A weight that did not resolve into either category and was not supposed to. It was simply what it was, and it was hers to carry, and she had accepted that somewhere around 3 in the morning on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range. She thought about the gesture. The hand raised toward nothing. She thought about what it meant to reach for something when you did not know if anyone was there to receive it, when you had run out of the right channels and the authorized procedures, and you were standing alone on an access road in December. And the only thing you had left was the impulse to indicate to something or someone or no one in particular that you wanted out. She thought about Daniel Cross in a hospital room in Spokane talking to people with badges and recorders delivering the accounting that would take years to resolve. And she thought about the window he had not sealed, about what it cost a person to leave something open when closing it would have been easier. She had filed it in the category of things that were true about people and could not be made untrue by any amount of understanding. She had decided that carrying it was the honest response to something that resisted resolution. She pushed through the double doors. The cold air of Missoula in December hit her face directly and without apology. She breathed it in. It smelled of coming snow and old timber and the mineral cold of a mountain city in the deep part of winter. An honest smell, a smell that did not need anything from her oil. She stood on the steps for a moment and looked at the street. Ordinary, a woman walking a dog in a heavy coat, a delivery truck idling at a corner, a traffic light cycling through its sequence for no one in particular. The world doing what it did when no one was watching it do anything remarkable. She walked down the steps. The medical building was at the end of the block, and someone in there was going to look at her shoulder and her forearm and tell her what she already knew. She would fill out a form and answer questions, and then she would do whatever needed to be done after that. There would be more rooms and more questions and more institutional processes, and she would move through all of them the way she moved through everything with the attention and discipline that 14 years had made into something she no longer needed to decide to apply. But that was later. Right now there was just the street in the cold and her own footsteps on the pavement and the knowledge that she was still here and still moving and that these two facts, plain and undecorated, were sufficient. She thought about what survival actually was stripped of the things it was routinely decorated with. Not triumph, not the clean arc from crisis to restored order that the stories told. Survival was the condition of being the person who was still there when the interval ended and the next phase began. The decision to put one foot in front of the other into whatever came next, carrying the weight of what had been done and what had been done to you. Moving forward, not because forward was better, not because the path was clear, but because stopping was the one thing she had never known how to do. She reached the end of the block and turned north. Behind her on the other side of the mountains, she had come down from the snow continued to fall, not covering anything, not erasing anything, simply falling the way snow fell because the conditions that produced it existed and it had no opinion about what lay beneath it. The access road, the cleared ground of the compound, the burned rectangle, the paths between structures that were already softening at their edges, already beginning to belong again to the landscape that had always owned them. In a week, if no one came to maintain the structures, they would begin to look like features rather than intrusions. In a season, the perimeter would be indistinguishable from the surrounding timber. In a decade, there would be nothing left but a slight depression in the earth, and the tree line would have taken back several feet of clearance on every side, and the mountain would look exactly as it had looked before anyone decided to build anything on it. Clean, enormous, patient, entirely indifferent. Kate Mercer walked north through the cold morning of Missoula, Montana, with her rifle on her right shoulder and nothing in either hand, and she did not look back at the mountains. She walked. The ground was cold pavement, dusted with overnight snow. It asked nothing of her except that she continue. She continued.